That bucket back. All right, we'll give David a minute to come back. I can share a funny story in the meantime. I'm trying to schedule a meeting with someone, and the assistant is scheduling the meeting, the assistant for the other people I'm trying to meet with. And so a week ago, they came back and said, hey, how about this time? And I said, unfortunately, I'm not available during that time. I'm available during these times. And so they said, okay, I'll go back and work with the team. So I hadn't heard anything for like a week. So I pinged them today and I said, hey, do you have an update? And they're like, how about this time? Which is the same time they originally suggested. And I'm like, unfortunately, I still can't make that time. Anyway, I was like, wow, we've made a lot of progress in this week.
Yeah, David's back to save us from the jokes.
Yay. Does he have audio? I think he's in Tatooine. But it's got like an IKEA desk or something. It's kind of a weird. So what's that background, do you think?
No idea. Okay.
I shouldn't make fun of his background then.
What
How about now?
I can't hear you.
It's muted. No.
We still can't hear you.
I like that the mute went away, but the mute effect did not. It's proof that David is on a Linux machine.
Oh, this is a Mac.
Oh, now it's Max headroom coming in now.
But now we can hear you at least.
One of my teammates had a Linux machine, and there were so many video problems that he has a Mac just for video conferencing.
That's a good idea. All right, so is this working enough?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you and you can hear us. And then
Okay. Yeah, I'm just in multi-device mode. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Well, there's, I think, 2 agenda items. So the first one is BFT is now part of Substrate. Woohoo! Somehow we inherited more maintenance burden. Yay! No, I'm just kidding. It's great. Thanks for the work, Rich, and everybody else at the on the Voltron side for that. I think it's really good. You know, we've been over here at Sundeck. We've been starting to get wound up using it, and so great to try to help push it forward. Anybody want to talk about anything on that front? My assumption was I was just going to set all of, if David hasn't already done it, my plan was to just set the same people who are contributors on the other Substrate projects as contributors there too, or like.
Yeah, I was sort of hoping that it would automatically happen, but I haven't checked.
Yeah, I don't remember the position systems well enough. I think we'll have to add it to the contributors group and set the same terms, but we won't have to do it on a per person basis. I think it'd just be like.
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably need to look into like the website stuff too, because I think it was using some Voltron data GitHub website.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah.
Does that website still work? No, it doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a 404 when I try to hit the URL. All right. Okay. Well, we have an issue. That's good. Means we're making progress.
Oh, well, I had to remove the submod. So the website needed the submodule to work for some other stuff. So I need to add that back too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I guess that's the first thing this morning is to make sure we can get it back into working status.
I'm gonna create a ticket. I didn't assign it to anybody. Cool. And then if there's nothing else on that, David had a second topic, which is the test file format. I don't know if people have seen that PR yet.
Is it a PR an issue?
There is an issue and there is a draft PR.
Ooh.
So before we decide what we actually want to do, yeah.
I had not looked at that yet, but I'm skimming it, and yeah, that seems good.
So I think it's worthwhile for me to give a quick sort of backgrounder on this, where it came from as a starting point. So, we want to get to effectively 100% coverage of functions that exist in Snowflake and the subset of those functions that also exist in DuckDB. Because we're working on an emulator that basically maps Snowflake to DuckDB. And so as we started to progress on test cases in BFT, which is where this is all inspired from, as we initially started adding test cases to BFT, there was kind of two main things that there were several dynamics that we kind of were struggling with. The first was that it's so the BFT format is a YAML format, which is easy to parse for a computer. But if you want to review coverage of test cases as a human and or add test cases, both of those are pretty onerous, I would say. And so that was kind of the first challenge. The second challenge was that there was, I think that there's some ambiguities around some type stuff. Remember that when we were trying to introduce the decimal stuff, it was a little bit weird there. That basically like the literal format was not, I think, fully specified there. And then the third thing is that we felt like there's a distinction between the test framework and the specification for what function should do. So in the core repo, the Substrate repo, we're basically defining the semantics of functions. Okay. And so we feel like that's really having examples of inputs and outputs of Substrate inputs and outputs is really part of trying to define what the semantics of the function are. Now, separately, you may want to run those against, whatever systems that exist out there. You want to have a test framework to be able to run that against, say, CUDA or whatever, or your own engine. In our case, our own engine, right? Like we probably won't introduce IceCap as a dialect, or IceCap's the name of the emulator, as a dialect or a test module inside of BFT. But we want to be able to run those test cases against our stuff as well. And so we were thinking that it would be more logical to have the definitions of the function semantics, including example inputs and outputs, in the core repository. Now, there would be it's kind of like the function extensions, right? There's no implementation of the functions in the core repository, but from our perspective, that's okay, because really what we're trying to do is specify what the behavior is, not how someone implements it or runs it. So anyway, so that's kind of the background on this. And so we had a PR we were kind of iterating on, which was just like, what's a good format? And initially we were starting to come up with something that was more compact, but still tried to use YAML. And it just felt like we were, and you can look at, actually, I can share the PR that we were kind of throwing around. And it just like, at some point we were just kind of like, we're forcing this stuff into the YAML format, and it's creating it's creating as much pain as it's help as it's giving. And so that's why we're proposing just having a straight text format that people can read directly. Now, the intention is that once we agree that this made sense for the scalar stuff, if it does make sense, to then look at other cases like aggregates. right? So like one of the weaknesses of the current BFT format is that an aggregate function cannot take in more than one argument in a, well, there's no clearly specified way to do that because the aggregate test cases express things as arrays, but really aggregates are run over tables, not arrays. And so there's questions about just like, okay, well, what would be the right format there and how should it be expressed in the test cases and whatnot. So we said, let's start with scalar. Let's try to get something proposed for scalar and work through that. And then if that works well, then we can do the same thing for aggregates and windows and, you know, maybe even go beyond those things. But initially the thinking was just right now, when someone adds a function, I think that we're very loose about what it means and really feel like it should become pretty tight about what it means, right? Like, so ultimately the goal would be is that when you add a function, you have to add a reasonable set of test cases or whatever, semantic declarations, you want to call it that instead, as part of the function. So people can be like, yeah, okay, I see what's going on. And that's also true for options, right? Like we've got all these different options. We should have example cases of each of the options and how that influences the inputs and the outputs, right? Whether it's an error case or whether it, you know, truncates differently or whatever the case may be. So anyway, that's the backing thoughts behind this PR/proposal.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. The text format versus YAML format. The closest analog I can think of to this is like SQL logic, which is like parsable, like large format SQL tests, and this seems like it's a good equivalent to it. I'm a fan of having more stuff in the core repo about what beyond just the definitions of the functions in terms of like, hey, like if you implement this, here are the behaviors that you need to implement to be compliant with our system. And then this is useful because then we can hit other systems with this. And if I go to the repos and be like, hey, you are not substrate compliant per the test cases in our repo that we have to determine compliance, it's a lot easier than having to make arguments in each repo. I can just be like, hey, I wired up this thing to run. Because the nice thing about this as well is like, theoretically we can have some limited scripting around to basically parse these, generate substrate plans that we can send to systems and get back and look at the results. Like you can embed these in full like substrate plans theoretically and make it easy to check systems that consume substrate beyond like not just at the function interface level, but like, or you can embed these in substrate plans and run if the system can run a full substrate plan, you can run this test and then you can get the results out and compare them and get a pretty quick like yay or nay.
Yeah, one of the intentions was actually on that point was we're working in Substrate Go. So our intention is that that we add a utility to Substrate Go that can read these files and produce you know, the pieces of a substrate plan that these files represent, which is basically a function invocation and a literal. Right, this function invocation returns that literal, and so then someone could work within Substrate to decide how they want to validate it.
Yeah.
So the question of whether, I mean, so the one way to go would be to say, okay, we're going to take BFT, we're going to merge it into Substrate core, and which or the Substrate the same repo as the definition, and so now you have the capability to test it. Test it against all the tests that we have. We'll also move the consumer testing in. Now you have lots of dependencies on other systems in the core substrate. So you have this sort of
well, but there was no suggestion of that. At least I'm not suggesting that.
Well, it's and you put in the definition for a way to test it in the place that's not actually using the test seems like a strange separation to me.
Well, but it's not a way to test it. It's declaring what the function semantics are. You have to think about it. I think that calling it a test file is probably the wrong thing. It's further definition of the semantics of that function.
Conformance.
But I mean, but that's exactly the purpose of BFT and consumer testing, right? BFT is the functions, consumer testing is the relations.
Well, no, I mean, I think that there's two different things. There's declaring what they are, and then there's testing to get that against random systems and random languages. So I think of those as two discrete things.
Yeah, and I can see you having to come back to in order to test a particular or get a system up, you would have to go and make changes in Substrate, potentially make changes in Substrate core and changes in BFT at the same time. Well, I mean, I guess you have to have some way of referencing the tests and disabling tests, which
Yeah, that's, I mean, BFT to me is the dialects, is being able to test dialects, right?
Right, but there's these things work, these things don't, right? And you don't have it. There's, at least with this particular thing, there's no option for that.
Yeah, there is. I mean, to me, it's the same as it exists now, right? Like, is that there's dialects and then there's tests against functions in BFT, but they're two different things, right? And so we're saying keep the dialects in BFT, keep the test harness in BFT, right? It's just that they're because here my point in part is that like BFT shouldn't be the only person who consumes this set of semantics, right? Like in Substrate Go, we want to use these semantics, and so like we want to be able to prove that these semantics are true in Substrate representation. And I don't think we should need to pull in BFT for that. Now we're pulling in the dialect from BFT, right? But to me, that's the semantics of the functions. Like think about it differently. Like ignore for a minute like all the repos. Like the fundamental argument that I'm making is that the function definitions, right? And if you actually look at sort of the early writings about function YAMLs, is we specified that they were trying to describe the semantics of the function, right? And so I had originally intended to include the test cases in the YAMLs. Now the YAMLs have gotten so big that that seems problematic in different ways, right? But like to me, saying that we have clearly defined semantics of a function without there being tests associated with that. And so like to me, like here's the reality, right? Is that like right now when we're adding tests when we're adding a new function, right? Right now the pattern is add the function over here, add the definition of the semantics over there, right? Which is separate from I want to make this function, I want to declare that this function is available to a particular engine, right? Because I kind of feel like the addition of the semantics is separate from like, hey, and it works in Snowflake or it works in, whatever, Data Fusion. But I think that like ideally the test baselines or the semantic baselines, like I mean, I reasonably would argue that like even input and output tests, input and output plans, I could see that being in the Substrate core. Right? Because we're saying like, hey, this is the semantic of a join. This is what a valid join result would be. Like what this plan produces this result. That seems to all be sort of reasonable specification for what the semantics of that part of a plan means. Now there may be 5 different ways that people then try that, right? Like I would think that for like anybody who's doing anything proprietary, they're not going to put their test framework in the Substrate repositories, but that doesn't mean that they don't want to use the test cases. I don't know. I feel like I've run across we've run across something that is different in David's head for sure. Based on your responses, I'm curious, Rich, because you've also worked on a bunch of this stuff. What your feelings are.
I think I am slightly confused. I guess similar to David about like having all of the test cases in one repo and then the test framework in another repo as well. So I haven't been able to take a look at the issues yet either. So I guess I'm not entirely sure all of the details of what's missing in the BFT test cases that would be provided in this, I guess, these new test files.
Yeah, so I think I think the main thing I would say is that Substrate's core from my point of view is a specification. I believe that there will be many test frameworks that consume that specification, not one. Sure, we have one, but I don't think that that's the only one. And so specifying the test framework, the test cases outside the context of any specific framework, I think is of value.
But if it was just Substrate, if BFT was named Substrate test cases, instead, I mean,
Well, the problem, the main problem I have though is that like
it's like
right
where
now-
is the question? It's not really that we shouldn't have it. It's just, you know, where should
yeah,
it?
well, but there is a real thing that I think is an issue, which is if someone contributes a function, what is the bar that needs to be achieved to accept the function? Like, I think that that's a real question that we have not answered to date, right? Like right now, it's pretty casual, right? Like, hey, there's this function in this system. I'm going to add some information in the function YAML about it, and that's been our bar, right? I'm
Right.
suggesting that. I'm suggesting that. So go ahead. Sorry.
I'm going to say the reason that works is because right now everybody is. It's not about Substrate currently isn't about compatibility. It works because the receiver and the consumer and producer are a matched set, like gluten and Velox, right? They can change whatever they want as long as they're on the same page. It just works.
Well, but I would say it doesn't work right now. Like I would disagree with the statement that it works right now. I would say that there are like that it's not a specification that someone can sit down and implement. So I mean like if you have someone writing two systems and making them work and they happen to grab some code out of Substrate and use it as part of the thing, they're getting something, yes, but I don't feel like that has all that much to do with the Substrate specification. Right, like as a concrete example of that, right, is like, if I recall correctly, the test case, like there's no, as a concrete examples, I don't believe that there were any decimal test cases until we started to try to introduce some recently. And there was no pattern for confirming that the output type of decimal function operations is correctly matching the output derivation rules, right? Like, and these are the things that I think, this is where I think that some of the differences are here, is that, I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, David, on the Spark Connect stuff, is what level of correctness does one want to achieve? Like from one system to the next, and making sure that the behavior is entirely consistent, right? And so like we're trying to do something where we're basically saying we're going to replace A with B, and the user can't tell the difference, right? Which is very different than you're going to replace A with B and it'll work mostly the same. Right.
Right. So this is part of our push to make things interoperable. And that's good. I guess the part that I can see that replacing the format to make it easier to use, that seems reasonable. I mean, there's obviously discussions about the actual implementation of it. But the part that I'm concerned about is actually is the day-to-day changes of making changes to to essentially BFT. And if that work is split across the two, it might be annoying. And I guess that's my main concern. But we could also just try it and see. And then
and to your point, David, as well, I think there's also a bit of a question there where, like, if we include, let's say we rename BFT to like substrate function conformance, whatever. Like, if we put the tests in that, then it means that, okay, I want to add a new function to the core spec, and I need to make a PR to the core spec. I need to make a PR with tests to the substrate spec repo. So that's now 2 PRs to add the tests, and then you get execution for free. Versus if it's all in the core repo, It's like I've added, this PR adds the function and the test in line. And then, yeah, maybe we have to update the submodule in the conformance checker or some such to pull them in.
Then you need a PR that actually pulls in the new things, finds out that the tests are wrong, and then goes back and changes it changes the answers, because we're not actually running the tests in core, right?
But I think that that's backwards, David, from my point of view. Is it's not the tests are wrong, it's that the systems don't conform to the spec.
Also, we
No,
already have.
but if I go in and put and say that 1 + 1 is 7, and then I go and try to run it against the test to discover that it's wrong, and I have to go back and fix it, and I have to go back and change the spec, right? The fact that we're not running it is a problem.
This is already a problem because we have issues where we will make changes to the Substrate core spec that we will try to read in Substrate Java, and they are wrong because the extension has been formatted incorrectly. And actually, I think this is a problem, and I think this feels like actually like a CI problem of like, you're adding a new test. Cool. Run BFT, pull in this file dynamically, and try running it. Does it fail? And it's like, okay, is that a bug in BFT or is that a bug in like the spec? Like this feels like a CI problem that we already have to some extent.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean,
Yeah,
so going to what Victor said for a minute, like that, like his scenario is what I think we are struggling with right now, and why we were driven to do this is that like we're just like, so how do you, so like to concretely, like how are we adding functions, which may be different than how others have added functions, right? How we are adding functions is, and this is where I think here's an interesting example of this. Output type derivation is something that I think most people ignore right now. We're not, right? And I think, and we're working on decimal stuff where output type derivation is amongst the most complicated. And so we have no comfort to write a function definition until we've produced a bunch of test cases validating that the behavior is a certain way. Now we write those test cases, like we create those test cases manually, right? Like BFT doesn't work with Snowflake. Like, I don't know that it should. Like to me, we're trying to derive the behavior. Like we can't write the function definition until we built the test cases, which I think is different than how people have historically done it, right? Because I think that other things are simpler, right? Or they're like, oh yeah, we all know what that kind of means, right? But like when we're actually working on like one of the ones we've been fighting with for the last 2 weeks is there's a bitwise knot for decimal in Snowflake. And what the fuck that means, I don't know. And the output type derivation is actually really, really confusing, right? And so the only way that we can specify that in Substrate is to go and write a bunch of test cases, right? And I'm not saying write, like I'm saying like hand write SQL statements that we run inside of Snowflake to try to figure out what's going on to make sure that we correctly specify it. And so our process has been come up with the test cases, confirm all of the behavior, create the function because of that. And then right now the pattern is now commit the function to the core repository, then propose the patch and commit the patch to the BFT repository. And so the whole thing is kind of a little bit backwards because we're starting with the test cases, we're then writing the function, then we have to commit the function first before we can commit the test cases. And so the thinking we had is that specification, right, the actual like work to actually figure out what is the specification of the YAML should start with test cases. It shouldn't be that the test cases are an afterthought after the function definition. It's the function definition is basically expressing what the YAML. It's the pointer into the test cases, if you will. And so that was why we were like, yeah, this feels backwards. And I understand that that's not how anybody has been approaching it, I think, up until now. But like when you get into time, like all the stuff, anything that's a compound type, really, or parameterized type, whatever we call them, right? The moment you get into those things, you're just like whatever, precision, right? Like I add a timestamp, 6 with a interval compound 9. What the heck is the output type, right? And I don't know the answers. I have to actually do the tests. So anyway, so that's just to go into what Victor said. Like yeah, we're just like, this is confusing because like I'm not running any of those tests in BFT, and I don't know that I ever will. I'm not even sure that that's BFT's role to run tests against Snowflake. I know that we proposed something, I think that we have there, but we don't run it except locally because we don't want to pay for Snowflake as a team. But yeah, it's this weird loop that's kind of backwards to from our point of view. Anyway, Rich, you were saying something. Sorry.
To extend that point as well, like internally, if we had a repo of like, here's a bunch of SQL logic style function tests that I can run against our internal consumer that we will never add to BFT because it's a hodgepodge of like free systems that we run internally, but I can run these end to end. Like if I have access to a like file full of test specs and a Go script that can parse these and give me like, here's the little substrate expression. That's like basically all I need to be like run at CLI, hit my engine a bunch and figure out where we're like breaking. And I think in this world, BFT becomes like our like a first-class consumer that we support of our test expression format. And it's kind of like an example of like, hey, we use this ourselves to run tests against these open source systems or to verify various things about them. That may not be what BFT is. I'm not really familiar with the consumer testing side of things and the BFT side of things. But I feel like they could both be canonical conformance checking things based on our like spec test frame or test spec. Words.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the case of the stuff that we're doing, we don't actually have an intention to use BFT to test our stuff, but we will run these test cases. But we're going to run them as unit tests. Right, like we're not gonna. They're not full stack tests. They're going to be run as unit tests. Like, hey, if I take this function and I give these arguments, do I get that output? So like I think BFT is good for like. I think BFT and consumer testing are right. They're integration tests, right? And that's useful. But I don't think that the tests, specifically for functions at least, I don't think the tests define integration tests. I think they define unit tests, and then we have a framework which runs those as integration tests. So I think it's kind of two different levels of testing that exist there.
So BFT technically doesn't involve like producing or consuming substrate plans, whereas consumer testing does.
Yep.
I guess if we were to use these news test files, is that something that we would want to start using in consumer testing as well? Because in consumer testing, what we do is that for example, for each of the functions, we'll have like a SQL query or something. And then we, at least as of right now, we take that SQL query, we run it through DuckDB, then in order to just get like a saved results file. And then using each of those SQL queries, we'll go through all of the available substrate producers. Those producers will produce a substrate plan, and then those substrate plans are run through each of the available substrate consumers. And then it'll kind of check to see if what the results were from those consumers match up with the initial result set that we had.
That's clever.
And then we save snapshots of these, like the snapshots of the results and snapshots of each of the substrate plans that were generated from each of those producers.
Was there a website with the consumer testing results? I vaguely remember this being a thing.
Yeah, there was a matrix providing it, but you'll see that most of it is red except for like, producers and consumers from the same backend. So like
that goes back to David's point that a lot of systems are self-consistent, but they're not consistent in the broader ecosystem.
Yes.
I think that makes sense as like step one for like you're integrating with Substrate, like be self-consistent. But then step two is where stuff like the test framework or like a conformance checking framework is used. So to be like, you are using the spec, you are holding it wrong. Here's the stick, please. Your interop doesn't work unless you actually do things correctly.
I mean, I think Rich, I think it's a good question. I don't know that I have, at least myself, spent a lot of time thinking about rationalizing the BFT versus consumer testing. Like I do think that I think that there are many consumers of like this function thing, like which to David's point, there are two different things that are going on in this PR and proposal. One is just, hey, let's reformat the test files so that they're easier to look at, right? And there's all sorts of iterations we can go through in that process, and we've gone through a few ourselves before we tried to propose something that was reasonably thought through, because we've kind of gone through a few and we're like, oh, this is awful, that's awful. And then there's a second thing, which is, hey, it feels like these things are part of function definitions, not part of any specific test framework. And I think really what we're talking about is the latter thing. I think that the latter thing is the one that's like the former thing, the format itself is kind of a tactical thing. Like, sure, we can iterate on that. The latter thing about where these things collect together. And so like my thinking is that there would be different consumers of these test semantics, whatever you want to call these files, test files. And so I could totally see one tool using them to generate SQL statements, right? Which is what, I think largely BFT does. Another tool using them to write unit tests inside of an existing tech, right? Like I could see the Java project basically just say like, hey, I want to make sure that output type derivations inside of isthmus are matching the output type derivations of functions that are defined inside of the test cases. And so I'm going to run a bunch of these test cases to confirm that they behave in the correct way. I could see it being used inside of the consumer testing where you say, hey, I'm going to use these maybe with BFT. So BFT is a SQL producer. So I'm going to use these and BFT to generate a bunch of SQL test cases and then run those round trip through the different consumer testing matrix. Right. So I definitely could see all of those things being reasonable consumptions of this data. Yeah, I think that the one of the key questions that I was thinking about is longer term, what do we want? The requirement of a function implementation, a function definition. What is the requirements to contribute one? And if I were to, ignoring repos, let's say we put everything in the same repo, which more and more I wonder whether that's a good idea. We made a mistake to put all these different repos together. But setting that aside, right? Because some of this stuff becomes less, like Arrow has a lot of weaknesses because of the monorepo, but it also, I think there's some number of strengths that things are not so thought of as so discrete, and patches that need to cover new features that cover several modules can be done as a single patch. Anyway, but yeah, the question to me at the core of this is that what is necessary to contribute a function? Because I kind of feel like that is a bar where I feel like we need to move the bar up. And then it's like, okay, well, what's the process to contribute a function? And so like, if you ignore all the repos, as I was saying, I think that the requirement to contribute a function ideally would be valid YAML, collection of test cases. I don't think that it's necessary to have to introduce a dialect to be able to produce test cases. And I think that people, when they look at that function, they should look at it and be like, hey, this feels like a set of test cases that's insufficient to describe that semantics. You haven't covered enough of the edge cases, right? Like, hey, you just introduced 4 new options, but your test cases don't exercise any of the options. So don't introduce options unless you have test cases that take advantage of those options, right? Like, I feel like that's a conversation that I think is a reasonable conversation that, ignoring repos, I think we should start having. And so then the question is like, okay, what's the best way to do that separately? But I'm wondering whether other people feel that way about the functions, or if that's something that we're kind of more alone in feeling.
I think with like that in mind, the format makes even more sense to me in terms of like looking at the YAML. If someone wants to add a new function, they have to add tests, and then they have to figure out the YAML format. That's going to be tricky for one to figure it out. I mean, having our own custom test format, they'll also have to learn theoretically. But then on the review side, if I have to look at, here's like a one-liner with an option embedded in it, with this result, I'm like, I can read that and scan it pretty quickly. Versus if I have to do PR reviews for multi-line YAML things of like, okay, for this case, you have this function in here, the arguments are here, the options down here. It's just gonna like, it's like the review burden is going to be quite challenging. I think it'll be hard to write and hard to read. So in that sense, like the test format makes sense. I think where it lives, we can figure that out. But I think the core idea makes sense. I think the core idea of like, if you add a function, you should add behavioral tests for it makes sense. And I think that's what we're going to need partially to like get to the next level of like people are using Substrate. How do we check that they're using it correctly?
So I guess
Our desire was to put those two things into PR. If that's the minimum footprint for what a function should be, we wanted that to be in one PR.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
I
about that from this. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think all of that makes sense to me. I guess, and as part, I guess before being able to merge your PR, we would want to make sure that all of these test cases, do they work against like all of those existing backends we have in the BFT as well?
I wouldn't gate it on all of the backends, but maybe a reference backend if we. Well, that's a trick because like there's a lot of things that we're going to add as a test case. We're like, here are all these options, and there are engines that don't even look at function URIs for things. Where it's like that's well, like I guess it's hard to. It would be difficult to gate on test failures because there's a lot of cases where the consumers won't behave correctly. But it might make sense to have a CI check to be like, oh, the tests are failing. And we can be like, the engine is wrong versus the test case is entirely wrong. I think a good action item for this might be like CI improvements, both around function extensions and to like if we add them, like make sure they're still parsable. And to David's point as well, like the limited testing to be like, well, once we have this wired in somewhere for a consumer that can actually run the tests in some way, like wiring that in somehow would be useful as well.
I think that the other thing that I totally agree. I think that let's say that we did put it in the Substrate core repo, right? Having the core repo say, okay, I'm going to run the BFT repo with this as the substrate. This is the source of the tests as opposed to the current main as the source of the tests. Seems to make a lot of sense to me. I would not put that I would put that as something that we need to look at, but not necessarily something that is a check that must pass. Because I think that probably, I don't know, but I would guess that half of the test cases that exist right now, that's not true. I think it's probably not as bad because the test cases, the coverage is not huge, but I'm guessing that there are test cases that are not being fully validated right now. And then as we start to fully validate, so anyway, so like adding more I think adding more things, we're going to realize that the BFT stuff is not, the dialects are not correct. I think is part of what's going to happen. And so saying like, hey, you can't add this test case because the dialect is incorrect in BFT. Like to me, I'd be like, no, it's a bug in the BFT. We should add the test case. But I think we have to look at that, right? Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it. I think we should look at it. And when something fails, when it's upgraded to BFT, BFT gets pointed at this PR. We should be looking at it and saying like, is that a problem with the PR or is that a problem with BFT? And then make that decision. And then, if it's a problem with PR, fix it in the PR for sure, right? Like David said, you put 1 + 1 = 7, right? And on all the BFT, like all the fucking tools fail, like we shouldn't merge that PR, right? Now the flip side is that for existing test cases, right? The intention we have, and there's actually a script in that PR or one of our other PRs that we have, which converts all the existing test cases to the new format. So that would be the next step, is like convert all the test cases to the new format and have BFT consume the new format. I think what will happen though is that we'll start adding test cases. There's two sets of things that we're doing. Adding test cases for functions that already exist. And that's the situation where there's a risk that when we introduce the test cases, BFT is going to fail, right? Because it's going to be like, oh, well, we didn't have test cases for that function. Now we do. And now we're seeing that the systems don't conform, or they, whatever. The test cases are working against a different function than what the systems have, right? Like that's realistically what will likely be the case, is that these two systems behave differently in this case. Like overflow, I did a LinkedIn post recently about overflow inside of Snowflake and how it doesn't behave, from my point of view, right. It seems like a fucking bug. Pardon my French, but it seems like it's just broken. And so you're like, okay, well, what are the test case? So then I'm like, okay, well, we need to find an alternative set of math functions for Snowflake from what I think that'll look exactly the same, like the definitions of the math functions, or we have options or something. We have to have something that basically says like, hey, the overflow, it's overflow behavior B as opposed to overflow behavior A, which I think in the case of Snowflake is it doesn't overflow until it hits 128 bits, even though it'll go beyond 38 digits. Normally the system says I can't go beyond 38 digits, I'll overflow at 38 digits. And I'll throw an error. That's actually that's you read the docs for Snowflake, it says at 38, when I go beyond 38 digits, I will overflow and I will throw an error. Unfortunately, what it does is it actually goes up to 39 digits as long as it fits in 128 bits. And that's different than I think other systems. Like the systems I've worked on before will overflow once they hit that 38 digit, go past 38 digits. And so that'll require options and whatnot. So I think there's going to be test cases we're going to introduce against existing functions, and some of those are going to fail in existing systems. The BFT is currently saying is passing, right? I don't know how big that set is. I think it may be small because most of these things are pretty standard. Like if you get to like integer math, integer 32 math and stuff. And then there's the second set, which is new functions that we introduce. And in that case, BFT doesn't use new functions until you declare that they're being used by a dialect, right? And so I think we should be able to introduce functions without introducing them into a dialect, into BFT. And then if someone wants to say, yeah, that function also works in that tool, then they can work it against it. Now, the challenge that I have that I think David is speaking to is that like, well, how do we make sure that that works anywhere, right? If I introduce a new function and say, here's the baselines for the function, and it doesn't, and there's nothing that's being contributed that actually shows that it works against a particular system. Are we okay with that? And I guess my gut would be is we're probably okay with that for the next year, and then we raise the bar again, right? Like right now the bar is, I wrote a function and it sounds reasonable, right? So going from wrote a function and I provided test cases which seem reasonable, right? And then at some point I think it'll be wrote a function, provided test cases, and provided a test harness to run it against a system to show that those results do exist in some particular case. So I kind of feel like we'll ramp up the bar over time. That would be my proposal.
Like that strikes me as reasonable. I don't feel like adding the test is going to make things any worse. I think it opens us up to do things better. And to your point, we can like raise the bar further and further. And yeah, the problem of like, well, we added a new test, and is it breaking because it's wrong? Or is it breaking because the dialects or the consumers don't support it? I think that's going to be ambiguous for a while, but we can deal with that on a case-by-case basis. And if someone commits a buggy test, then we do what we've always done, which is we look at it and be like, oh, this is wrong, we can update it. We've already done it for extensions that are like unparsable.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I was proposing that we do is introduce a coverage check for all functions declared in the Substrate core. And that's how many test cases are there per function. And as part of that, my perspective would be is that would do two things. It would validate that the test formats are correct, and it would validate that the function definitions are correct as well. Like, because we don't really have, we only have, I think, a YAML check, but we don't have anything beyond that. And that's why you see functions get introduced in core that then don't work in Java, is because Java has a more complete set of checks than what core does. And so, like as a concrete example of that, right? Like in the core, if you introduce a function that has a function output derivation and you introduce test cases, it should check that the test cases match the function, the output derivation rules, right? Like that those two things are self-consistent, right? Like it's not actually running the tests. It's just saying like, hey, I've got this function. It has these 5 test cases. Do the 5 test cases match the definition of the function, right? In terms of the semantics of the function or whatever, right? Are you using options that are actually allowed or whatever it might be? So, but I think that the key thing that I feel is that David and Richard came into this meeting like not on the same page. I think Victor wasn't on the same page either, but like I think slightly closer to how we're feeling about it. I don't want to railroad the team on this, and so I don't think we should make any decisions here. I think I shared some thoughts about how we're thinking about it, and I'd love to sort of have David and Richard, and if there's others in the community that are interested as well, think more about it and give feedback.
I think Weston will have a lot of opinions on this as well, since he actually originally created the BFT framework. So I think he'll have a lot of thoughts on like the decision that he made too.
Yeah.
It might make sense.
Yeah,
to PR in the Slack for people to get a look at it. I guess also the mailing list for people that use email for things.
I think it'd be good to hear his thoughts. And I think that one of the things he had specifically identified as a something he punted on, I think was, I don't know exactly how he put it, but was clear definition of literals for types, so that everything is very well specified. And so that's one of the things I'm pushing my team on is that like we have this initial draft, but I said, hey, we need to come up with what the literal formats are for structured types as well.
I've got that in the text format, so I've added that to the PR as a comment. In case we just use the existing format.
I think that. So anyway, but one last thought on this. Victor said something which, to share personally, is something that I'm very aware of. So Victor was saying, hey, it's painful to try to review a new function definition with test cases when the test cases were in the YAML format. And that's where the new format came from, because I got a couple people on my team who are working on these functions, and they came back and they said, hey, here's all these test cases. And I'm just like trying to review the test cases and being like, hey, how good is the coverage? Are we hitting all the edge cases? Does the stuff make sense? Was challenging for sure.
Yeah, I'm somewhat concerned that we don't have a plan for Windows and aggregation tests just yet. I mean, maybe you have an idea of what it should look like. And that's all we really need is a plan. We don't need an implementation, but we need to basically say, okay, this format is going to extend to Windows and aggregations. And then we need to have an idea of what the relation test from consumer testing also is going to look like. Because if we have to go back and completely pivot and change the format again, that'll be annoying.
Well, I think it's a fair comment. I think of it as a different format. So like that was kind of one of the conclusions I came to is that for Windows and aggregation, so like in terms of like, do I have a picture in my head of how it should look? No, I don't. Or at least an idea of what I have ideas. And what happened was that we started to try to work on it for aggregates. And the immediately obvious problem is that you really need to define tables for aggregates, and then you need to apply function tests against the tables.
Mm-hmm.
For some cases, and this is the question that's in my head: is do you have two aggregate formats? Which doesn't sound great. I know I'm not excited about it either. But the existing framework uses a array of literals. So like if you think about max, right, or min or average, right, they're all single argument aggregate functions. Okay. And so you pass in an array of literals into that, and that array can suggest records as opposed to an array, right? Like it implies this is from several different records, right? The moment you go to two aggregate functions, which they already exist in our function YAMLs, it becomes like, okay, do I do parallel arrays? And if you think about things like as you get into other things, you start to say, the moment you're going beyond scalar functions, it feels like you should have tables as opposed to arrays. Now, there's some downsides to that, right? Like, and it goes to against a couple other things, right? Which is the moment you define a table, right? You don't have to repetitively define the type. You really need to define the schema of the table once, and then all of the literals don't need to be type annotated, right? And so the thinking I had was that it was, and that's why actually the proposal has the header being a scalar format version as opposed to just a test format version. So that we would have another one, which is aggregate, which would leverage some of the same ideas, right? Like if you want to express what the data type is, you use the same ways to express that and whatever. And when you try to talk about output, you probably use the same literal format. But for the inputs for the aggregate function, there's a question of whether or not we should just have a different format for that. Or we should have two different formats, one for single argument aggregates and one for multi-function argument aggregates.
Like
The other
the flip side would be that we have everything uses tables, and scalars use tables, and aggregates use tables, and windows use tables. But then it's harder to write scalar tests, which are probably more common than aggregate tests and window tests. Like there's an argument for
there's
a format for everything. There's an argument for having separate formats.
yeah, like to me,
But
like go ahead.
You could define a more complicated format that looks like this for the scalar format. But that's just having an idea of what you want to do in the future. So yeah, I guess that's also sort of an action item, is to sort of think if we can figure out ways to extend this form to handle those other cases.
Yeah,
I mean, well, this is early on, and we're the primary users. If we figure out actually, if we did scalars, we added aggregates, we can actually unify these. We can unify it, and then we'll take the onus of the work to fix any consumers. That's mostly us at this point, or really only us.
Well, I mean, I think I know at Voltron Data we're using the BFT format, the YAML files, right? So when we change the things,
just to clarify, you're using the YAML files outside the use of BFT.
yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So that use case has already come to pass.
Mhm.
The website also depends, or it uses the the YAML files as well. But I hopefully that shouldn't be too hard to migrate over if we do change this file format.
It gets more annoying because you need, if this is going to be Antler parsed, you aren't going to be able to just use the Antler code to run the website. So either we have
it. Why do you say that?
I mean, you would. Okay, you just have to. You would need to have the JavaScript version of Antler.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the attraction to Antlers. It's kind of like protobuf, right? And then like, so I think the other thing that maybe we aren't using in other places Antler, I can't remember, is Antler has two modes. One's a visitor mode and one's like an object mode. And so if a grammar is correctly annotated, the object mode makes it sort of like, oh, here's an object hierarchy that I can consume for some other system. So anyway, I'm not saying Antler is the best thing ever. Like this is definitely a turn towards human consumability over machine consumability. Like absolutely. Like there's no doubt about it. We're making it harder for machines to consume so that we can make it easier for humans to consume. My thinking was that was a good shift.
I can see a world
having tried to review it,
where in Substrate Java and Substrate Rust and Substrate Go, we add the Antler generated code for these eventually, and maybe even like parsing them into something.
Yeah, the problem is the Antler generated code. You get the framework, but you don't get the actual business logic. So you have to add the business logic in every place that you actually want to do. So that's
what I mean. Like in the same way in Substrate Java that we parse the protobufs into like a nice representation that's easier. We would have to do the same for any language that we want to do it. I imagine, Jeff, because we're planning on using this in Go, you'll do that for Go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so we actually, and just like, this is like one of those things where it was like, we spent actually a decent amount of time trying to use YAML directly. and using like, and then you start getting to this realization that like the YAML specification, most tools don't fully implement the YAML specification. Because there's all sorts of rules about how to consume things and things that are in quotes or not. And so like if you actually look at some of the early versions of stuff, like I can send out this as the PR, and then I was like, okay, let's come up with something that's a format that can be easily parsed by without a parser. Not to say that it couldn't be a parser. I think it's probably useful to have a parser, but something where someone could just do splits and like, you know, like rudimentary string manipulation gets you to what you want, right? And I think that we're not actually too far from that. Like if you wanted to do a regex against that format and just use regex to get at stuff, or like regex plus some string manipulation, it's probably fine. Like there are pieces that are gonna be a little harder to get, right? Like in terms of like, hey, what's the name of this test case? But the core stuff I think actually could be pretty straightforward. And so that was part of my thinking is that if an engineer is actually saying gets an assignment, which is like to implement some substrate functions or test substrate functions, if they look at that format, even if they didn't know that the Antler stuff exists or doesn't exist for the language that they're working on right now, I think that all of us probably could create a parser by hand in a fairly short amount of time to go and consume those test cases. And so that's the other question here is that like, is it a, like, it's not SQL, right? It's not a, you know, a 10 million line grammar we're talking about. It's a relatively straightforward grammar. And so I would imagine a C programmer would just fucking be like, I'm not using Antler. I'm just gonna parse these files, or do it in whatever way that I like to my language.
You have to do once. We have to write the consumer once for each language, which isn't free. But looking at the format now, I look at it, I'm like, I don't know anything about the Antler, but I'm like, oh, based on what I'm seeing, I could write more of these easily. Like that's kind of like, this is optimized for writability, which I think makes a lot of sense for this. Like we're gonna be writing a lot more of these tests, and we're gonna be parsing them. So I guess we are over time, but also discussion about like, oh, window and aggregate functions has also sparked something in my brain, which is set returning functions and table value functions. Sure. I've been thinking about those lately because we have a bunch of them internally that we model in weird ways. I guess like maybe a quick room read, that's probably not a good last minute thing. Should those be like function extensions as well? Like should we have like scalar functions, window functions, aggregate functions, set returning functions? Or like table value functions in like extensions, or should those be like operators?
I think it's a good question.
Yeah,
I struggled with this, and the fact that you could like have your own relations, which could be just a set returning function is basically a custom relation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also fighting with Gluten about their generate relation. It's like, well, you know, without any documentation, I have absolutely no idea what it's supposed to do.
Actually, this has come up for us partially because we look at the DuckDB SQL logic test, and they're like, oh, we have like range. And I'm like, that's a generally useful table value function to be like, oh, it generates like integers from 0 to some number. But it's like, I don't have a clear way to model it. I don't want to have one relational operator per function. So maybe we need like a table value or like table set returning relation that consumes some extension format that you can add in. I might propose something about this.
I think it's worthwhile, and I think this is definitely a place where, like, the moment the functions get more complicated in any direction, any dimension, it's like, oh man, we need test cases for these because, like, it's just
window functions alone warrant so much testing. They're insane. Every time I look at them, I'm like, I don't know what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, that's the other problem.
Don't wait until you get to match recognize.
The actual test values don't necessarily tell you what's actually happening in the tests unless you look at every single value, which is annoying.
Anyway, so let's continue this conversation on Slack, GitHub, etc. I got to run. I appreciate the energy today, guys. I really do. And sorry if it comes a little bit out of left field. Like, I think, you know, anything that we can do to facilitate like migration, like you know, you said like, hey, you guys are using it internally, and I'm like, ugh, that sucks. Like, I don't know what language you're using it in, or be like, hey, let's make sure that the Substrate library, like maybe we make it as a requirement of this, is that the Substrate library for whatever language also has this stuff kind of stitched together so that you guys can easily move over to that, right? Whatever the right set of things are.
And maybe the first short term would be to have something that writes out the old YAML files, just a converter tool.
Yeah. I mean, we wrote the other direction one, so it would be relatively straightforward, I think, to write the reverse one.
Yeah, I
Cool.
got a lot of comments about the actual format itself, so you can deal with that too.
All right. All right, guys. Thanks so much. Talk to you later.
All right, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. I like it.